As the sun begins to set, the sprawling silhouette of Calke Abbey looms against a blood-orange sky, the sound of distant birds the only companion to its decay. Inside, a world locked away for centuries slowly reveals itself. Dusty furniture crumbles beneath the weight of its own history, while the air smells faintly of mildew and something darker. What happened to the grand estate once filled with life? What caused its decline? The reclusive Harpur-Crewe family, it obsessed with hoarding and isolation, chose to simply stop repairing their ancestral home, watching it rot as taxidermy animals and peeling wallpaper became the silent witnesses of their collapse. Calke Abbey stands as the eerie monument to a lost aristocracy, frozen in time. But what drove this once wealthy family to leave their mansion to decay? Was it madness, neglect, or a chilling reflection of their own unraveling? Chapter 1. The Rise of Calke Abbey. The Harpur-Crewe family didn't just build Calke Abbey, they crafted a legacy, one that would prove harder to sustain than they ever imagined. The story begins not with decay, but with ambition. In 1622, a remote corner of Derbyshire witnessed the birth of what would become one of England's most peculiar estates. The land itself seemed unremarkable at first glance. Rolling hills, dense woodland, isolation from the nearest market town. But this isolation would become both the family's defining characteristic and their curse. The Harpur family acquired the estate through marriage and shrewd financial maneuvering. Sir Henry Harpur, a baronet with political connections and mercantile wealth, saw potential where others saw wilderness. He envisioned a house that would stand as testament to his family's rise from the merchant class into the landed gentry. This was the dream of the newly wealthy, the aspiration to transform money into legacy. By 1633, construction began in earnest. The house rose from the Derbyshire earth with symmetrical precision. Baroque styling met English practicality. The facade stretched 150 feet across, punctuated by tall windows that promised light and grandeur. Inside, rooms multiplied, each one designed for a specific social function. The great drawing room, the state bedroom, at the saloon where guests would gather and connections would form. The cost was staggering. Over £3,000 in initial construction, equivalent to roughly £700,000 today. But Sir Henry saw this not as expense, but as investment. A grand house required grand maintenance, yes, but it also commanded respect. It attracted the right marriages, the right alliances, the right political opportunities. The Harpurs understood the mathematics of aristocratic life, and land generated rental income. Tenants farmed the estate's 3,000 acres. Coal deposits beneath the surface promised additional revenue. The house sat at the center of this economic web, both symbol and command center of the family's growing wealth. For over a century, the formula worked. Each generation added to the estate. They collected art, taxidermy, furniture, books. The house swelled with the artifacts of cultured living. Chinese wallpaper adorned the walls. Portraits of ancestors lined the galleries. The library grew to hold thousands of volumes on natural history, a passion that would grip the family for generations. By the late 1700s, the Harpurs had merged with another family, the Crews, through marriage. They became the Harpur-Crewe, a double-barreled name that announced their expanded holdings and elevated status. The new name came with new responsibilities, more land to manage, more tenants to oversee, more rooms to fill with evidence of their refinement. Sir Henry Harpur, the 7th Baronet, embodied the family's zenith. He expanded the natural history collection, filling rooms with specimens from around the British Empire, stuffed birds from Africa, minerals from Cornwall, insects preserved in cases. The house became a private museum, a cabinet of curiosities that demonstrated both wealth and learning. Yet even in this golden age, seeds of future decay were being planted. The family's passion for collecting began to outpace their ability to curate. Rooms filled faster than they could be organized. Specimens accumulated in hallways, in unused bedrooms, in attics. What started as a refined hobby slowly transformed into something more compulsive. The estate's very isolation, once seen as a mark of exclusive retreat, began to work against them. While other aristocratic families maintained London residences and participated in the social season, the Harpur-Crewe family increasingly remained at Calke. They hosted fewer guests, attended fewer events. The world beyond their gates became distant, abstract, less necessary. But in the early 1800s, this seemed like strength, not weakness. They owned their world completely. The tenant farmers paid their rents. The coal brought steady income. The house stood magnificent against the Derbyshire sky. The dream demanded everything, but it seemed to deliver in equal measure. How could they know that the very success they celebrated contained the mechanism of their eventual isolation? Chapter 2: The Darkening of the Harpur-Crewe. In a house built to impress, it was isolation, not grandeur, that marked the Harpur-Crewe family's downfall. The shift happened gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. Sir George Crewe, the 8th Baronet, inherited the estate in 1819. Unlike his predecessors, Sir George viewed the world beyond Calke with suspicion. The Industrial Revolution was transforming England. New wealth was rising from factories and railways. The old certainties of land and lineage seemed under threat. Sir George's response was retreat. He stopped traveling to London. He declined invitations to neighboring estates. Social calls went unreturned. The staff noticed it first, how the master would spend entire days in the natural history rooms, cataloging specimens, rearranging displays, avoiding all human contact beyond what was strictly necessary. His son, Sir John, inherited both the estate and this growing tendency toward withdrawal. But in Sir John, the family's eccentricities took on a darker hue. He developed an obsession with collecting that went beyond his father's scientific interests. He hoarded everything. Old newspapers stacked in corners, broken furniture stored in unused rooms, letters from decades past, filed and refiled, but never discarded. Yet the house began to change. Rooms that had once hosted dinner parties became storage spaces. The grand saloon, designed for entertaining 50 guests, sat unused while Sir John ate alone in a small parlor. The state bedroom remained perpetually prepared for visitors who never came. Dust settled on the Chinese wallpaper. The portraits of ancestors watched over emptier and emptier halls. Staff turnover increased. Servants found the atmosphere oppressive. The master rarely spoke. Whole wings of the house stood dark and unheated. The smell of mildew crept through hallways. But Sir John seemed not to notice, or perhaps not to care. He was building something, though what exactly remained unclear even to him. By the mid-1800s, the pattern was firmly established. Each baronet, became more reclusive than the last. Sir Harpur-Crewe, who inherited in 1844, took the isolation to new extremes. He rarely left the estate boundaries. He communicated with his tenants through intermediaries. He spent his days among the taxidermy collection, which had grown to include hundreds of specimens. The local community began to whisper. Stories circulated about the strange family at Calke Abbey. They owned vast lands but were rarely seen. They had wealth but lived like hermits. The house itself seemed to be fading from the landscape, receding into its own world of private obsession. Inside the walls, time moved differently. While Victorian England modernized and industrialized, Calke remained frozen. The family made no updates to reflect changing fashions. The Baroque interiors stayed untouched. New acquisitions were simply added to existing clutter rather than replacing anything. Nothing was ever thrown away. Nothing was ever changed. This was not mere eccentricity anymore. It was a form of madness, a collective delusion that the family could preserve their world exactly as it was through sheer force of will. If they never changed anything, if they never let anything go, perhaps time itself would pass them by. Perhaps they could remain forever in the moment of their greatest glory. But the world beyond the gates continued its relentless transformation. The 1860s brought agricultural depression. Tenant farmers struggled to pay rents. Income from the estate began to decline. Yet the family's expenses remained constant. The house still required heating, staffing, maintenance. The gap between revenue and cost began to widen. Cervantes' response was not to modernize or economize. Instead, he retreated further. Entire wings of the house were simply closed off to save on heating costs. The staff was reduced. Maintenance was deferred. If a window broke, it might be boarded rather than replaced. If wallpaper peeled, it was left to hang. The house began to speak in new ways. Floorboards creaked under the weight of accumulated possessions, and ceilings stained where roofs leaked. The smell of decay mixed with the musty scent of old taxidermy. Calke Abbey was transforming from a symbol of power into something else entirely. A mausoleum. A monument to a family that had chosen to stop participating in the world. By 1880, 3 generations of increasing isolation had fundamentally altered both the family and their home. What had started as aristocratic exclusivity had become pathological withdrawal. The Harpur-Crews were still wealthy, still owned thousands of acres, still held their title. But they had become prisoners of their own creation, trapped in a house that grew darker with each passing year. Chapter 3. The dream that demanded everything. As the Abbey's halls grew quieter, the dream that once sustained the Harpur-Crewe family began to suffocate under its own weight. The dream had always been simple. Preserve the estate, maintain the legacy, pass something meaningful to the next generation. But somewhere in the transition from the 1800s to the 1900s, that dream twisted into something unrecognizable. Preservation became paralysis. Maintenance became hoarding. Legacy became burden. Sir Harpur-Crewe, the 10th Baronet, embodied this transformation. He inherited Calke Abbey in 1886 at age 38. By then, the estate's decline was already well advanced. Untenant farmers were abandoning their leases. Coal revenues were falling as mines played out. The agricultural depression showed no signs of ending. A rational man might have sold land to raise capital, might have modernized farming practices, might have invested in new industries. But Cervantes was not interested in rationality. He was interested in preservation, not preservation of wealth or opportunity, but preservation of objects, of rooms, of the physical artifacts of the past. He expanded the hoarding to industrial scale. Every letter received was kept. Every newspaper read was filed. Every broken piece of furniture was stored. The house filled room by room, floor by floor, with the accumulated debris of daily life. What made this hoarding different from simple collecting was its lack of discrimination. Cervantes saved everything with equal fervor. A broken chair received the same care as a valuable painting. The cost of this obsession was measured not in money spent, but in opportunities lost. While other estates were being wired for electricity, Calke remained gaslit. While other families installed indoor plumbing, Calke still relied on chamber pots. The house itself became a time capsule, but not by design or for posterity. It was frozen because change of any kind had become impossible. Staff who worked at Calke during this period left extraordinary accounts. They described rooms so full of objects that walking required navigating narrow paths between stacks of furniture and crates. They described the master's obsession with routine, how every day followed an identical pattern. Breakfast at 8, morning among the natural history specimens, lunch alone, afternoon in the library, dinner in the small parlor, bed at 9. The rigidity extended to everything. Meals followed the same weekly rotation for years. Staff wore outdated livery from decades past. Clocks throughout the house were never wound, their hands frozen at different times, as though the family had decided that even mechanical time could be stopped through neglect. Cervantes married late, at age 52, to a woman named Georgiana. The marriage produced no affection that anyone could observe. They maintained separate bedrooms on separate floors. They took meals together, but rarely spoke. Georgiana adapted to her husband's eccentricities by developing her own. She began collecting birds' eggs, filling cabinets with thousands of specimens. Her collection rivaled her husband's in its compulsive completeness. Together, they presided over a house that was slowly eating itself. The roof leaked in 17 different places. Water stains spread across ceilings like maps of some unknown country. Wallpaper peeled in great sheets, revealing older wallpaper beneath. Layers of decoration from different eras, all visible at once. The Chinese wallpaper in the state bedroom, once worth a small fortune, hung in tatters. Yet nothing was repaired. To repair would mean to change. To change would mean to admit that the present was different from the past. And this admission was precisely what the family could not make. Their entire identity rested on the fiction that they were still the Harpur-Crewe of the 1700s, still powerful, still relevant, it's still grand. The 20-year period from 1890 to 1910 saw the dream reach its most Baroque expression. Cervantes spent money not on repair, but on acquisition. He bought more taxidermy, more books, more specimens for the natural history collection. The house groaned under the weight of these purchases, even as its structure deteriorated. By 1914, when the First World War began, Calke Abbey stood as a monument to a vanished world. The estate still covered thousands of acres. The family still held their title, but the reality was decay masquerading as permanence. The dream had demanded everything, and the family had given it, sacrificing their connection to the present in a desperate attempt to preserve the past. Cervantes died in 1924, having overseen 40 years of genteel decline. His son, another Cervantes, inherited an estate that was wealthy on paper, but crumbling in reality. The next generation would face a choice: adapt or collapse. But for a family that had spent a century choosing isolation over engagement, the outcome was already written in the peeling wallpaper and accumulating dust. Chapter 4: The Doors That Were Never Opened. Behind locked doors, entire rooms were abandoned to time, frozen in a haunting silence that spoke more of neglect than history. The younger Cervantes Harpur-Crewe inherited Calke Abbey in 1924, and with it, he inherited a problem that had no good solution. The house contained approximately 60 rooms spread across 3 floors. Of these 60 rooms, only about 15 were regularly used by the family. The remaining 45 existed in various states of abandonment. Some rooms had been closed for decades. The blue bedroom on the 2nd floor had last been occupied in 1870. Its door, when finally opened in later years, revealed a room perfectly preserved. The bed was made. Toiletries sat on the dressing table. A lady's dress hung in the wardrobe. Only the thick layer of dust and the smell of decay indicated the passage of time. It was as though the occupant had simply walked out one day and never returned. Other rooms had become repositories for the family's hoarding. The great drawing room, designed to host elegant gatherings, was stacked floor to ceiling with furniture. Chairs sat atop tables. Sofas were piled 3 deep. Between these stacks ran narrow pathways, barely wide enough for a person to walk single file. The room had not seen a social gathering in living memory. The state bedroom told perhaps the most haunting story. This room, the finest in the house, had been kept in permanent readiness for important guests. The bed was always freshly made with the finest linens. Candles stood ready to light. The fireplace was laid with kindling. But no guest had slept there since Queen Victoria's reign. The room waited decade after decade for visitors who would never come, a stage set for a play that would never be performed. What made these locked rooms particularly eerie was their completeness. They were not empty shells. They were fully furnished, fully decorated spaces that simply existed in stasis. Paintings hung on walls no one saw. Books lined shelves no one read. Clocks stood silent on mantels, their mechanisms long since failed. The younger Cervantes continued his father's practice of simply locking doors rather than dealing with deterioration. When the roof over the east wing developed serious leaks in 1928, his solution was not repair, but abandonment. The furniture in those rooms was covered with sheets. The doors were locked. Keys were placed in a drawer and forgotten. The wing was excised from the family's daily life, as surgically as though it had never existed. This practice created layers of abandonment. Rooms that had been closed in the 1800s remained closed. Rooms that failed in the 1920s were added to the growing list. By 1935, over half the house was effectively uninhabitable. The family moved through an ever-shrinking circuit of rooms, like a dying organism withdrawing from its extremities. The staff, reduced now to just 5 permanent members, understood the geography of these closures intimately. There were rooms they were forbidden to enter, rooms they could enter but only to verify no catastrophic damage had occurred, and rooms they were still expected to maintain, though even these received increasingly perfunctory attention. One housemaid, interviewed years later, described the experience of walking through the closed wings. The silence was absolute. No ticking clocks, no footsteps, just the occasional creak of settling wood or the scuttle of mice. The air smelled of mildew and old fabric and something else she could never quite identify. A sweetness that might have been rot or might have been the accumulated scent of 100 years of potpourri and perfumes. She described opening a door to what had once been a nursery. Inside, toys from the mid-1800s sat exactly as they had been left. A rocking horse stood in one corner. Building blocks were stacked on a table. A doll sat in a small chair, its porcelain face cracked, but still maintaining a blank smile. The room waited for children who had grown old and died generations ago. The closed rooms became a kind of accidental archive. Because nothing was ever thrown away and nothing was ever disturbed, they preserved in amber the daily life of earlier eras. A breakfast room contained table settings from the 1840s. A study held account books from the 1700s. A servant's room in the attic still had its occupants' meager possessions, abandoned when they left service sometime around 1900. But preservation through neglect is not the same as intentional conservation. Water damage spread unchecked. Wallpaper that might have been saved with timely intervention rotted and fell. Furniture that could have been restored instead grew moldy and unstable. The house was documenting its own decay with excruciating completeness. But by 1939, when the Second World War began, Calke Abbey had become a building of locked doors and forgotten rooms. The family had retreated to a small core of livable space, surrounding themselves with the vast bulk of an increasingly uninhabitable mansion. Every locked door was an admission of failure. Every abandoned room was evidence of a dream that had grown too large to sustain. Yet still the doors remained locked. To open them would be to confront the scale of the decay. To confront the decay would be to admit that preservation through stasis had failed. And this admission was something the Harpur-Crewe family remained psychologically incapable of making. So the doors stayed closed, and behind them, the rooms continued their slow transformation from living spaces into monuments of abandonment. Chapter 5. The Madness in the Walls. As wallpaper peeled and taxidermy animals gathered dust, the true madness of Calke Abbey became clearer. The family could not face their own demise. The term mad baronets was not used by the family themselves. It emerged from the whispered conversations of villagers, the observations of former staff, the accounts of rare visitors who glimpsed life inside Calke Abbey during its final occupied decades. But if the label was unkind, it was also not entirely inaccurate. The younger Sir Vauncey Harpur-Crewe, who inherited in 1924 and died in 1949, exemplified the psychological unraveling that characterized the family's last generation. He was not mad in any clinical sense. He managed the estate's diminishing finances with a kind of stubborn competence. He understood crop rotation and tenant agreements. He could discuss the finer points of taxidermy preservation. But his relationship with reality had become deeply, fundamentally warped. He lived according to rules that made sense only within the hermetic world of Calke. He insisted that meals be served in the formal dining room, even when he ate alone. The table, which could seat 24, would be set with full silver service at one end, while Sir Vauncey occupied a single chair at the other. Footmen who no longer existed would be invoked by name. The fiction of grand living was maintained with exhausting precision, even as the house literally crumbled around him. His relationship with time became particularly disturbed, and he refused to acknowledge that the current year was the 1930s or 40s. In conversation, he would reference events from decades past as though they had just occurred. He spoke of tenants who had been dead for 50 years, as though they were still farming the land. He made plans for improvements to the estate that would have been appropriate in 1880, but were absurd in 1940. The staff learned to navigate this temporal displacement. When Sir Vauncey asked about the harvest, they understood he meant the fantasy harvest of his imagination, not the actual failing crops in the fields. When he discussed preparations for guests, they knew to nod along, even though no guests had visited in years. Reality and delusion had merged so completely that separating them would have been cruel and pointless. His wife, Ermine, whom he married in 1920, developed her own coping mechanisms. She created her own wing of isolation within the already isolated house. She took over certain rooms for her exclusive use and forbade anyone, including her husband, from entering. Inside these spaces, she built elaborate dioramas using the house's vast taxidermy collection. Dead birds were arranged in tableaux depicting scenes from mythology. Stuffed mammals were positioned as though engaged in human activities. Her most elaborate creation was a reconstruction of a Victorian tea party using taxidermy animals dressed in period clothing. A badger in a dress sat pouring imaginary tea. Rabbits in waistcoats occupied the other chairs. The scene was maintained for years, dusted and rearranged, but never dismantled. Staff who saw it described feeling profoundly unsettled, as though they had stumbled into someone's feverish dream made physical. The couple rarely spoke to each other directly. They communicated through staff or through notes left in agreed-upon locations. They took meals in the same room, but at different times. They slept on different floors. The marriage existed as a legal fact, but not as a relationship in any recognizable sense. Their daughter, Hilda, grew up in this environment of Baroque dysfunction. Born in 1921, she experienced childhood in a house that was simultaneously vast and claustrophobic. Entire wings stood empty and forbidden. Rooms she could enter were stuffed with objects and furniture to the point of immobility. The outside world was presented as dangerous and inferior. Hilda was educated at home by a series of governesses who rarely stayed long. The isolation and strangeness of Calke proved too much for most. Those who remained did so only because employment was scarce and the pay, if irregular, was adequate. They taught her the conventional subjects, but could do nothing to prepare her for a world her parents pretended no longer existed. By the time Hilda reached adolescence in the mid-1930s, the patterns of family madness had fully imprinted on her. She developed an obsessive interest in the natural history collection, particularly the bird specimens. She would spend hours staring at individual birds, memorizing every feather, every detail of their glass eyes. She spoke to them sometimes, conducting one-sided conversations that staff could hear echoing through empty corridors. The Second World War penetrated even Calke's isolation, but only barely. Food rationing affected the household. Some staff were conscripted. But the family's fundamental detachment from the world remained unchanged. Sir Vauncey seemed genuinely confused by the war's impact. Why should distant events affect life at Calke? The house had always been self-sufficient. Let the outside world manage its problems. In 1945, as Europe celebrated peace, Calke Abbey marked the occasion with nothing. No celebration, no acknowledgement. The war had been an inconvenience, not a catastrophe. Life continued in its established patterns. Meals at the same times. The same ritualized movements through the same shrinking circuit of habitable rooms. Sir Vauncey's death in 1949 prompted no real change. Hilda, now 28 and unmarried, I inherited an estate that was essentially ungovernable. But govern it, she tried, or rather, she continued the family tradition of pretending to govern while actually presiding over ongoing collapse. The madness had progressed from individual eccentricity to systematic delusion. The family no longer distinguished between preservation and paralysis. They believed that by changing nothing, they were maintaining everything. The peeling wallpaper was not decay, but patina. The leaking roofs were not failures, but character. The rooms full of hoarded possessions were not symptoms of pathology, but evidence of cultured refinement. By the early 1950s, the madness had become architectural. The house itself seemed to embody and amplify the family's psychological disorders. Its labyrinth of locked doors mirrored their emotional inaccessibility. Its layers of accumulated objects reflected their inability to let go of the past. Its deteriorating structure manifested their denial of mortality and change. Calke Abbey was no longer just a building. It was a physical expression of a family's collective insanity, a monument to the human capacity for self-deception. Chapter 6. When the walls began to speak. The Abbey's crumbling walls whispered the family's secrets, secrets they would never dare speak aloud. By 1955, Calke Abbey had developed a voice. Not a supernatural presence, though the staff sometimes wondered. Rather, the accumulated decay had reached a point where the building communicated constantly through sound and smell and physical manifestation. The sounds came first, creaking that followed no pattern of thermal expansion or wind stress. Crashes in empty wings where something, a piece of plaster or a section of ceiling, had finally surrendered to gravity. Dripping water that created irregular rhythms throughout the house. The scuttle of mice and rats that had colonized the closed rooms. At night, these sounds blended into a kind of chaotic symphony, an acoustic reminder of ongoing dissolution. The smells told their own story. Mildew dominated, that distinctive sweet rot of organic materials slowly decomposing. But beneath it were layers of other scents. The chemical tang of degrading taxidermy, the musty paper smell of deteriorating books, the sharp note of bat guano from the attic colonies. Walking through Calke meant moving through distinct smell zones, each one marking a different variety of decay. And the walls themselves had begun to reveal their secrets quite literally. Where wallpaper peeled away, it exposed earlier decorative layers. The state bedroom, papered in the 1800s with expensive Chinese silk wallpaper, now showed 5 distinct eras of decoration. The current paper hung in shreds. Beneath it, a Victorian floral pattern. Under that, Georgian striping. Each layer a chapter in the house's history, all visible simultaneously. But the secrets were not just architectural. The deterioration was revealing the family's hidden history in more disturbing ways. When a section of ceiling collapsed in the East Wing Library in 1956, it exposed a space between ceiling and floor above. Inside this space were dozens of letters, apparently hidden there sometime in the late 1800s. The letters documented an affair between a family member and a servant, a scandal that had been literally papered over. Other revelations followed. A locked drawer in the main bedroom, its lock rusted through, fell open to reveal morphine bottles from the 1870s. The drug had been legal then, but the quantity suggested use beyond medical necessity. A chest in the attic contained women's clothing altered to hide pregnancy, along with correspondence about a child sent away. The house was betraying its keepers, spilling secrets they had worked to bury. Hilda Harpur-Crewe, now the estate's sole occupant save for a skeleton staff, watched these revelations with increasing distress. Each exposed secret felt like a personal violation. The house was supposed to preserve the family's dignity, not expose their failures. But she lacked the resources to control the decay or the energy to catalog and hide what it revealed. Her response mirrored her father's. She locked more rooms. She forbade staff from entering areas where secrets had been exposed. She created new rules about where people could and could not go. But the house was too large and the decay too advanced. She could not police every collapsed ceiling or open drawer. The financial situation had become desperate. Agricultural rents, already declining for decades, had fallen to almost nothing. Many tenant farms stood abandoned. The coal revenues had disappeared completely. Death duties from her father's passing had consumed most of the liquid capital. Hilda was land-rich and cash-poor, owning thousands of acres but unable to afford basic repairs. In 1958, she made a decision that felt like betrayal, but was actually pragmatic surrender. She approached the National Trust about potentially acquiring Calke Abbey. The organization, founded to preserve historic buildings, had been acquiring struggling estates since the 1930s. Yeah, perhaps they could save what she could not. The initial survey by National Trust representatives was devastating. They documented structural failures in every major section of the house. The roof needed complete replacement at a cost of £80,000, more than the estate's annual revenue. The walls showed evidence of rising damp throughout. Window frames had rotted. Chimneys were unstable. The list of necessary repairs ran to 30 pages. But what shocked the surveyors more than the decay was the hoarding. They estimated that the house contained over 10,000 distinct objects, from valuable paintings to worthless broken furniture, all jumbled together in rooms and hallways. Cataloging the collection would take years. Separating the valuable from the worthless seemed almost impossible. The National Trust ultimately declined to acquire Calke in its current state. The cost of repair was too high. The historical significance, while real, did not justify the expense. They suggested Hilda sell items from the collection to fund repairs, then reapply. But selling would mean sorting, and sorting would mean confronting the scale of the accumulation. Hilda could not do it. By 1960, the walls had become brutally honest. A section of the main staircase collapsed, requiring expensive temporary shoring. Water infiltration had caused structural damage to load-bearing beams. The house was not just speaking anymore, it was screaming. But the family member who remained had inherited generations of practiced deafness. Hilda's daily routine contracted further. She used perhaps 6 rooms regularly: her bedroom, a small sitting room, the kitchen, a bathroom, the library where she spent most of her time among the natural history specimens. The rest of the house existed in what staff described as suspended animation, neither maintained nor demolished, neither living nor dead. The staff itself had dwindled to just 2. A housekeeper who came 3 days a week, a groundskeeper who maintained the immediate gardens. Both were elderly, Both had worked at Calke for decades. Both understood that they were witnessing the final chapter of something that had lasted centuries. They watched Hilda move through her shrinking world with a mixture of pity and incomprehension. She was not yet 40, but seemed ancient. She wore clothes from the 1920s. She followed routines established by her father. She spoke of the estate's future as though it had one. The delusion that had characterized her parents now fully possessed her. The walls continued their relentless confession. Each season brought new failures. Each year made the house less inhabitable. By 1965, whole sections were genuinely dangerous to enter. But Hilda remained a lone occupant of a 60-room mansion, and maintaining the fiction that everything was fine, even as the physical evidence screamed otherwise. The walls had begun to speak, but the last Harpur-Crewe, like her ancestors, had chosen not to listen. Chapter 7. The Cracks in the Legacy. As time wore on, the Harpur-Crewe family's once proud legacy began to crack, leaving them with nothing but a decaying monument. The 1970s brought a reckoning that could no longer be avoided. Hilda Harpur-Crewe was now 50 years old. She had never married. She had no children. The Baronets, which had passed through an unbroken male line since the 1600s, would die with her. The estate, the house, the collections, all of it would need some resolution. The financial mathematics had become impossible to ignore. Annual income from the estate was approximately £12,000. Annual costs, even with minimal maintenance and skeleton staff, exceeded £15,000. The shortfall came from selling small parcels of land or items from the collection. But this strategy had limits. Each sale reduced future income. Each year the gap widened. The house itself had crossed from deterioration into danger. In 1972, a chimney stack collapsed through the roof of the west wing. The crash could be heard throughout the building. When staff investigated, they found not just fallen bricks, but the revelation of structural rot, far worse than anyone had imagined. The roof timbers had been attacked by beetles for decades. They were hollowed shells, supporting weight through habit rather than strength. A structural engineer was finally called. His report was apocalyptic. The entire roof needed replacement. Multiple chimneys required rebuilding from foundation level. The main staircase was unsafe. Several ceilings were in imminent danger of collapse. Floor joists throughout the building showed evidence of rot. His cost estimate for making the house safe, not restored, but merely safe, was £350,000. Hilda received this news in her small sitting room, surrounded by taxidermy birds and family portraits. The engineer later described her reaction. She simply nodded, thanked him for his time, and asked that he send the written report. There was no shock, no dismay, just a kind of tired acceptance. She had known, and of course, anyone who lived in the house knew. The report merely quantified what the creaking floors and falling plaster had been announcing for years. But knowing and acting are different things. Hilda had no access to £350,000. Even if she sold significant land, agricultural values had collapsed in the 1970s recession. She could perhaps raise $100,000. It was not enough. It would never be enough. The National Trust was approached again. A different set of surveyors came, this time accompanied by historians and conservators. They spent 3 weeks examining the house room by room. Their findings were extraordinary. Yes, the building was failing. But the very neglect that had caused the failure had also preserved something unique. Because the family had changed nothing for over a century, Calke Abbey contained a complete record of aristocratic life across multiple eras. Rooms from different periods stood intact, and objects from the 1700s sat beside those from the 1900s. The hoarding had created an accidental archive of material culture. One historian described it as a three-dimensional museum of English country house life. The taxidermy collection alone contained over 1,000 specimens. Many were scientifically significant, species now rare or extinct, prepared using techniques no longer practiced. The Natural History Library held first editions worth thousands. The furniture, though deteriorating, represented every major style from Baroque through Victorian. But valuing the contents was different from preserving the container. The trust faced a dilemma. The collection was worth saving. The building was arguably too far gone. Could they extract the valuable items and let the house die? Or was the house itself, in its state of preserved neglect, the most valuable artifact? Debate within the trust extended over 2 years. Preservationists argued for complete restoration. Pragmatists pointed to the cost. Historians suggested a third way. Preserve the house exactly as found. Don't restore it to some imagined Georgian glory. Instead, stabilize it in its current state of decline. Show the public not a fantasy of aristocratic life, but the reality of aristocratic decay. This concept was revolutionary for 1970s heritage conservation. The standard practice was restoration. Remove all evidence of damage. Return the building to some theoretically original state. But Calke offered something rarer, a chance to preserve honest decline, to show what happened when the money ran out and the dream collapsed. Hilda was presented with the options in 1976. The trust would acquire Calke, but only if she agreed to their unconventional approach. They would stabilize, not restore. They would preserve the accumulation, not sort and purge it. They would present the house as a monument to decay, not grandeur. The family legacy would be saved, but as a cautionary tale rather than a celebration. She understood what this meant. Her ancestors would be remembered not for their achievements, but for their failure. The house would become famous not for its beauty, but for its deterioration. The Harpur-Crewe name would be associated with madness and hoarding, rather than culture and refinement. Everything the family had worked to build would be reinterpreted as pathology. Yet what choice did she have? The alternative was total collapse. The house would fall into complete ruin. The collections would be dispersed at auction. The land would be sold off piecemeal. At least this way, something would survive, even if that something was a monument to failure. In 1977, Hilda agreed to the National Trust's terms. The transfer would not be immediate. She would remain in residence until her death, living in a small apartment within the larger house. The trust would begin stabilization work immediately. The public would be admitted. The family's private world would become a public exhibition. The papers were signed in the small sitting room where Hilda had received the engineer's report 5 years earlier. She was 56 years old. She was signing away 350 years of family ownership. The legacy she inherited was broken. The best she could do was ensure the evidence of its breaking would be preserved. As the trust's workers began their assessment of what could be saved and what was beyond help, Hilda retreated further into her small apartment. The sounds of the house changed. Voices of workers replaced the silence. The smell of preservation chemicals joined the scent of decay. The house was being rescued, but the rescue felt like violation. The walls she had lived within her entire life were becoming someone else's story. The cracks in the legacy had grown into chasms. What had seemed eternal proved temporary. What had felt like strength revealed itself as brittleness. The Harpur-Crewe family had tried to preserve everything and ended up preserving only their failure. The legacy would survive, but not in any way they would have wanted. Chapter 8. The haunting beauty of decay. What was once a grand symbol of aristocracy now stood as a haunting reminder of everything they had lost. When the National Trust began its stabilization work in 1978, the team faced something unprecedented in conservation history. They were not restoring a ruined building. They were preserving decay itself. The instructions were radical: stop further deterioration, but maintain the current state of decline. Make the house safe to visit while keeping it visibly broken. The result was a new category of historic site: neither ruin nor restoration, something in between, a house arrested mid-collapse. Scaffolding held up dangerous ceilings, but the ceilings themselves remained cracked and stained. Windows were made weatherproof, but the peeling paint was left untouched. The effect was unsettling, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Walking through Calke after stabilization was like moving through a three-dimensional photograph of decay. The state bedroom remained as it had been for decades. The Chinese wallpaper hung in elegant tatters. The bed was still made with linens from the 1920s, now yellow with age. A lady's dress from the 1880s still hung in the wardrobe, moth-eaten but recognizable. But what made the room extraordinary was its completeness. This was not a reconstruction. Every object was original. The dust was real dust, accumulated over decades. The smell of mildew was authentic decay. The spider webs in the corners had been spun by generations of spiders over years of human absence. The room was not a museum display. It was an actual abandoned bedroom, stabilized and made accessible. The drawing room, stuffed with piled furniture, became a haunting tableau of aristocratic excess. Chairs balanced on tables, sofas faced walls. Between the furniture mountains ran pathways barely wide enough to navigate. The conservators counted 273 individual furniture pieces in a room designed for perhaps 30. The hoarding was made visible in overwhelming physical detail. The natural history collection proved equally powerful in its preserved state. Over 1,000 taxidermy specimens filled multiple rooms. But these were not carefully curated museum displays. They were crammed onto shelves, stacked in corners, hanging from ceilings in dense clusters. Dust covered everything. Glass eyes stared from faces frozen in permanent surprise or aggression. The specimens were scientifically valuable, but displayed this way, they seemed more like evidence of obsession than scholarship. Visitors who came in the early years after opening reported feeling genuinely disturbed. This was not the usual stately home experience. No polished furniture or cleaned paintings. No docents explaining the family's achievements. Instead, they encountered raw evidence of psychological disorder. Hoarding made architectural. Decay presented as artifact. The smell particularly unsettled people. Despite ventilation improvements, the house retained its characteristic scent of mildew and old taxidermy. Some visitors found it unbearable. They would tour for 10 minutes, then flee for fresh air. Others found it essential to the experience. The smell made the abandonment real, It transformed the house from historical site into visceral encounter with decline. The National Trust's documentation team photographed every room before and during stabilization, so the images revealed extraordinary details. A bathroom where toiletries from the 1920s sat alongside those from the 1880s. A kitchen where copper pots hung in permanent readiness for meals that would never be cooked. A nursery with toys arranged as though children had just stepped out for lunch. But the most powerful documentation came from something unexpected. When conservators examined the layers of wallpaper throughout the house, they found that the Harpur-Crewe had papered over existing paper rather than removing it first. This created a historical record in layers. By carefully separating the papers in select locations, they could read the house's decorative history backwards through time. In the main bedroom, 17 distinct layers of wallpaper were identified, spanning from 1740 to 1920. Each layer represented a moment when the family had tried, briefly, to update and maintain. Each layer also marked the moment they had given up removing the old and had simply covered it over. The wallpaper became a metaphor for the family's entire approach to life. Never removing, never confronting, just layering new denial over old. The conservators debated how to present this discovery. They ultimately decided to create a small display where several wallpaper layers were partially separated and labeled. Visitors could see the physical manifestation of accumulation and avoidance, the past literally showing through the present. By 1985, Calke Abbey had become famous for its unconventional preservation. Heritage professionals came from around the world to study the approach. Could decay be conserved? Should it be? What did it mean to preserve failure as carefully as success? The house attracted a particular type of visitor, not those seeking traditional heritage tourism with its comfort and nostalgia, but those drawn to the melancholic, the abandoned, the honest presentation of decline. The attendance numbers were modest, 25,000 visitors a year compared to hundreds of thousands at fully restored estates. But those who came tended to stay longer and engage more deeply. Hilda Harpur-Crewe, still living in her small apartment within the building, witnessed this transformation with complex emotions. The house she had known as private prison was now public exhibition. Strangers walked through rooms that had been locked since her childhood. They photographed the evidence of her family's madness. They discussed, often within her hearing, the pathology and failure that the house represented. Yet there was also something relieving about it. The burden of secrecy was lifted. The shame of decay was shared. She no longer had to pretend that everything was fine. The house itself was telling the truth. And while that truth was unflattering, it was also oddly liberating. The haunting beauty of Calke lay precisely in its honesty. Other stately homes presented a sanitized version of aristocratic life, perfect rooms in perpetual readiness. But Calke showed the reality, the hoarding, the isolation, the decay, the inability to maintain, the gradual collapse. It was beautiful not despite the decay, but because of it. Beautiful because it refused to lie. Chapter 9. The Moment of No Return. In the end, the Harpur-Crewe family made one final, tragic decision to let Calke Abbey fall into complete ruin. Actually, that's not quite accurate. They never made a decision. That was the point. The defining characteristic of the Harpur-Crewe family's relationship with Calke Abbey was the absence of decisive action. They never chose restoration. They never chose demolition. They never chose sale or modernization or adaptation. They chose only inaction, and inaction chose everything else for them. The moment of no return cannot be precisely dated because it was not a moment at all. It was a process extending over decades. But if one had to identify when the decline became irreversible, it would be sometime in the early 1900s, when Sir Vauncey Harpur-Crewe, the 10th Baronet, inherited an estate already struggling and chose to respond by retreating further into fantasy rather than engaging with reality. At that point, with decisive action, the estate could have been saved. Sell the least productive land, modernize farming practices, reduce the house to a manageable size. Many aristocratic families made exactly these choices and survived. But Sir Vauncey did none of this. He chose hoarding over action, isolation over engagement, preservation of objects over preservation of wealth. Each subsequent generation inherited not just the estate, but the accumulated consequences of these non-decisions. The younger Sir Vauncey inherited his father's passivity. Hilda inherited both their patterns of avoidance. By the time she was making choices, or rather failing to make them, in the 1960s and 70s, the range of possible outcomes had narrowed to various flavors of managed decline. The tragedy was not in the decline itself. Many estates declined. The tragedy was in the family's inability to confront and adapt to that decline. They possessed enough wealth right up to the end to have salvaged something. A smaller but sustainable estate, a house reduced to manageable proportions. A life lived within their means rather than haunted by fading grandeur. But confronting decline would have required admitting it existed, and this admission violated everything the family's identity was built upon. They were the Harpur-Crews of Calke Abbey. They had held this land since 1622. They had accumulated these collections over generations. To sell land or collections would be to admit failure. To reduce the house would be to betray ancestors. To live modestly would be to accept diminishment. So instead, they chose slow-motion collapse disguised as preservation. They locked rooms rather than repair them. They hoarded rather than curate. They isolated rather than adapt. Each choice was framed as defending the legacy. Each choice actually accelerated its destruction. The National Trust's acquisition in 1977 represented not a decision by the family, but a surrender to inevitability. Hilda did not choose to transfer the estate. She simply ran out of alternatives. The money was gone. The house was failing. Her death would trigger estate taxes that could not be paid. The trust offered the only option that involved anything surviving at all. Even this surrender was characterized by passivity. Hilda did not actively work with the trust to plan the transition. She agreed to their terms, then withdrew to her apartment and waited. The transformation of her home into a public museum happened around her rather than with her participation. She was present but not engaged, watching from the margins as strangers took possession of her family's accumulated history. Hilda died in 1989 at age 68. She had lived her entire life at Calke Abbey. She had known no other home. She had maintained no life outside its walls. When she died, the last link between the house and the family that built it was severed. The trust found her in her bedroom, surrounded by her natural history specimens. She had apparently died in her sleep. The room was examined as part of the estate settlement. It contained her clothes, all decades out of style, her books, mostly on natural history and ornithology, her personal correspondence, which amounted to almost nothing. She had received virtually no letters in her final years. she had sent even fewer. Her will was simple: everything to the National Trust, which already effectively owned it. A small provision for the 2 elderly staff members who had remained employed. No personal bequests because there were no people in her life to bequeath to. The loneliness evident in the document was almost more haunting than the physical decay of the house. The moment of no return had come and gone so gradually that nobody noticed it passing. There was no dramatic collapse, no sudden crisis, no clear before and after. Just a slow accumulation of choices not made, repairs not undertaken, connections not maintained, until the family found themselves in a position where survival was no longer possible and had not been for a very long time. After Hilda's death, the trust completed its cataloging of the house's contents. The final inventory ran to over 7,000 pages, over 10,000 objects, furniture from every period since the 1600s, art ranging from masterpieces to amateur daubs, taxidermy representing species from 6 continents, books, clothes, letters, receipts, broken tools, empty bottles, mysterious boxes whose contents remained unidentified. The inventory became a kind of autopsy report on aristocratic life. It documented not just what the family had owned, but what they had kept. And what it revealed was an inability to let go of anything. Every generation's possessions were preserved alongside those of their ancestors. Nothing was ever discarded. Nothing was ever sold or given away unless financial crisis forced it. This compulsive retention was the physical manifestation of the family's psychological core. They lived in terror of loss. Losing land would mean losing status. Losing possessions would mean losing connection to ancestors. Losing the house would mean losing identity itself. So they held on to everything, even as holding on guaranteed that eventually they would lose it all. The moment of no return was the moment they chose preservation over life. It happened so early in the family's history that later generations did not even recognize it as a choice. It simply was, the defining feature of being a Harpur-Crewe. But that choice, made once and never reconsidered, set them on a path that could end only one way: in abandonment, decay, and the transformation of their home into a monument to everything they feared most: change, loss, and the unstoppable passage of time. Chapter 10: The Weight of Silence. Calke Abbey's silence is now its loudest feature, a silence that tells the story of everything the Harpur-Crewe family failed to preserve. Visit Calke Abbey today, and the first thing you notice is the quiet. Not the peaceful quiet of a well-maintained country house, not the reverential quiet of a museum, but an eerie, heavy silence that seems to press against your eardrums. The silence of abandonment. The silence of ending. Over 40,000 visitors come each year now. They walk through rooms where the Harpur-Crewe family once lived. They photograph the peeling wallpaper and piled furniture. They peer at taxidermy birds and read labels explaining the family's obsessions. But even with crowds, the house maintains its fundamental quietness. Perhaps this is because the visitors themselves become quiet. The usual chatter of heritage tourism dies in these rooms. People whisper if they speak at all. Children instinctively lower their voices. The house enforces its own atmospheric rules. This is a place for contemplation, not conversation. The National Trust guides are trained to maintain this quality. They do not offer the cheerful commentary typical of stately home tours. Instead, they provide context quietly, pointing out details without breaking the spell. a water stain on the ceiling from the 1950s, a pile of unopened hatboxes from the 1880s, a room locked since Victorian times and opened only for conservation. What makes the silence particularly powerful is what it replaced. Calke Abbey was built for sound. The Great Hall was designed to echo with conversation and laughter. The drawing room was meant for musical entertainment. The dining room anticipated the noise of large dinner parties. Every architectural feature assumed a house full of people and activity. But that sound never really filled the house, at least not in living memory. The isolation began too early. The withdrawal was too complete. By the early 1900s, the house was already quiet. By the mid-1900s, it was silent. What visitors experience now is not the silence of recent abandonment, but the accumulated quiet of multiple generations of retreat. The rooms themselves seem to absorb sound. Decades of dust and deteriorating fabric create unusual acoustics. Voices die quickly. Footsteps are muffled. Even the creak of floorboards seems subdued. The house has become an acoustic as well as visual monument to decay. The Trust has made a deliberate choice not to fill this silence with artificial sound, and no period music plays in the background. No audio guides provide constant narration. The silence is treated as an essential part of the experience. What the Harpur-Crewe family could not preserve was noise, life, connection, futurity. What remains is their silence, and the Trust has chosen to honor that remainder. In the state bedroom, where the Chinese wallpaper hangs in tatters, visitors often spend long minutes without speaking. They look at the bed, still made after decades. They examine the clothes in the wardrobe. They notice the water stains on the ceiling. The room requires no explanation. The silence speaks eloquently of everything that was lost. The natural history rooms present their collections in perpetual quiet. The stuffed birds will never sing again. The mounted mammals are frozen mid-movement, permanently still. The insects under glass are posed in death tableau. The collections are records of life captured and silenced, and they mirror perfectly the family's trajectory. Staff who work at Calke report finding the silence oppressive at times. Being alone in the building after closing, with only the creak of settling wood and the occasional skitter of mice, can be unnerving. The house feels occupied by absence. The rooms feel like they're waiting for something that will never come. Some visitors find the silence meditative. They appreciate the space for reflection that the house provides. In a world of constant noise and stimulation, Calke offers something rare. A place where quiet is not just allowed, but required. Where contemplation of failure and loss is built into the architecture itself. Others find it unbearable. They rush through the tour, uncomfortable with what the silence forces them to confront. The evidence of mental illness, the waste of accumulated possessions, the loneliness of lives lived in voluntary isolation. The silence makes these realities unavoidable. The weight of this silence is not metaphorical. It has physical presence. It presses on the chest. It fills the ears. It occupies space the way sound normally would. This is silence as substance, as artifact, as the house's most honest communication about what happened here. The Harpur-Crewe family tried to preserve everything: their land, their house, their possessions, their status, their name. They succeeded only in preserving silence. The silence of empty rooms, the silence of ended conversations, the silence of a family line extinct, the silence of a dream that demanded everything and left only quietness behind. This silence is now Calke Abbey's offering to the world, not the usual heritage narrative of triumph and achievement, but an honest accounting of what happens when preservation becomes paralysis, when fear of loss leads to total loss, when the effort to maintain forever results in an ending profound in its completeness. Stand in the main hall now, where 300 years ago, the Harpurs first moved into their new house full of ambition and hope. Listen to the silence. That silence contains every unfulfilled dream, every unmade decision, every chosen isolation. It is the sound of a family that retreated from the world until the world forgot they existed. It is the loudest silence you will ever encounter. Chapter 11. A legacy forgotten. What does it mean to leave a legacy behind when that legacy is built on the sands of neglect? The Harpur-Crewe family survives now only as a case study. Students of psychology examine their hoarding behaviors. Historians use them to illustrate aristocratic decline. Conservators cite Calke Abbey when discussing whether decay itself can be a heritage asset. The family wanted to be remembered for their collections, their taste, their place in society. Instead, they are remembered for their failure. This is perhaps the cruelest irony. The family spent generations trying to preserve their legacy. They kept everything. They threw nothing away. They maintained rooms and collections long past any rational purpose. All of this effort was directed toward ensuring they would be remembered, and they are remembered. Calke Abbey is famous. It attracts scholars and tourists. It appears in documentaries and academic papers, and the Harpur-Crewe name is known far beyond Derbyshire. But they are famous for precisely what they most feared: their dysfunction, their isolation, their inability to adapt. The natural history collection they assembled over 2 centuries is indeed valuable. Museums have borrowed specimens for study and display. Researchers have used the collection for scientific papers. But the collection is valued not for the taste it demonstrates, but for the pathology it reveals. It is studied as evidence of obsessive hoarding, elevated to aristocratic scale. The house itself has become an important heritage site, but not in the way the family would have wanted. It is not celebrated as an example of architectural beauty or refined living. It is preserved as evidence of what happens when preservation becomes an end in itself. When maintaining the past prevents engaging with the present. Visitors come to Calke not to admire, but to witness. They witness decay. They witness hoarding. They witness the physical manifestation of mental illness. The house has become a kind of warning rather than a celebration. Look what happens when you cannot let go. Look what happens when isolation becomes identity. Look what happens when the dream of preservation destroys what it meant to preserve. The family's obsessive documentation provides an ironic coda to their story. They kept every letter, every receipt, every mundane record of daily life. Historians now have an incredibly complete picture of aristocratic domestic life, precisely because the family could not bear to throw anything away. The very compulsion that contributed to their downfall now enables detailed study of their decline. But this wealth of documentation reveals the emptiness at the family's core. The letters are largely business correspondence. The personal papers are thin and formal. There is little record of affection, of joy, of meaningful human connection. The family documented their isolation meticulously. They left behind evidence of everything except what might have made their existence meaningful. Research into the family's history reveals a pattern that repeated across generations. talented, educated people who retreated into increasingly narrow lives. Men who could have participated in public life but chose seclusion. Women who could have had social circles but remained isolated, each generation reinforcing and amplifying the patterns of the previous one. The psychological autopsies performed by later scholars identify clear patterns of avoidant personality disorder, hoarding behavior, and possibly spectrum conditions that made social interaction difficult. But diagnosis from a distance is speculative. What is clear is that the family created an environment where these tendencies were not just tolerated, but enabled and amplified. Hilda Harpur-Crewe's life, in Examined Through the Documents She Left Behind, appears almost unbearably sad. 70 years lived in increasing isolation. No significant relationships. No experiences beyond the estate boundaries. Her entire life contained within the walls of a deteriorating house. She had wealth, education, advantages of class, and she used them to construct an ever smaller world. The legacy question becomes philosophical. The family wanted to preserve their name and achievements for posterity. They succeeded only in preserving evidence of their retreat from life. Is this a legacy at all? Or is it the opposite of legacy, the documentation of everything that prevents life from flourishing? The National Trust's interpretation of Calke Abbey wrestles with these questions. They present the family neither as villains nor victims, but as people trapped in patterns they could not escape. The house is explained not as a moral lesson, but as a historical reality. This is what happened. These are the consequences. Draw your own conclusions. Yet conclusions seem inevitable. A family with every advantage chose isolation. They had wealth, but lived in growing poverty of experience. They had a magnificent house, but made it uninhabitable. They had centuries of history, but contributed little to the future. They wanted to be remembered and achieved only notoriety. The Harpur-Crewe legacy is not forgotten, but it is remembered in ways they would find horrifying. Not as cultured collectors, but as hoarders. Not as refined aristocrats, but as case studies in dysfunction. Not as preservers of tradition, but as exemplars of how tradition can become prison. Perhaps this is fitting. They spent their lives trying to control how they would be perceived. They stage-managed their public face. They hid their dysfunctions behind locked doors. And in death, all of it was exposed. The locks opened. The hidden rooms revealed. The truth of their lives put on public display. The legacy they leave is honest in a way they never were while living. It admits failure. It acknowledges dysfunction. It reveals the cost of isolation. In trying to preserve a false legacy of grandeur, they inadvertently created a true legacy of warning. The legacy is not forgotten. It is simply not the legacy they tried to leave. Chapter 12. The Death of the English Aristocracy. Calke Abbey stands as a final, or eerie reminder of the English aristocracy's slow and painful death. The story of Calke Abbey is ultimately not about one family. It is about the end of an entire social class, the dissolution of a system that had organized English life for nearly 1,000 years. The Harpur-Crews were not unique in their decline. They were simply more honest or more pathological in their refusal to adapt to that decline. The English aristocracy died slowly across the 20th century. Death duties, implemented in 1894 and expanded after both world wars, steadily drained aristocratic capital. Agricultural depressions reduced land values and rental incomes. 2 world wars killed heirs and disrupted estate management, New wealth from industry and finance displaced land as the primary source of power. Many aristocratic families adapted. They opened their houses to tourists. They sold land strategically. They married into new money. They diversified their assets. They maintained the symbols of aristocracy while abandoning its economic reality. These families survived, though often as curators of their own history rather than as functioning centers of power. But some families could not adapt. They clung to the old ways, even as the old ways became impossible. They retreated rather than engaged. They preserved rather than evolved. The Harpur-Crewe were the purest example of this death through non-adaptation. They chose extinction over transformation. What makes Calke Abbey so powerful as a historical site is its refusal to disguise this death. Most stately homes present aristocratic life at its peak: restored rooms, polished silver, manicured gardens. They offer a fantasy of aristocratic continuity, as though nothing essential has changed. But Calke presents the reality: the decay, the hoarding, the retreat, the end. This honesty makes visitors uncomfortable. We prefer our history sanitized. We want to admire the past and not confront its failure. But Calke refuses to provide that comfort. It insists that we look at what happened when the money ran out and the social relevance evaporated. It forces us to confront the human cost of clinging to dying systems. The broader decline of the English aristocracy followed economic inevitability. Land stopped being the primary source of wealth. Titles stopped conferring automatic authority. The social networks that had made aristocracy powerful dissolved as society democratized. By the late 20th century, aristocrats were either diversified business people who happened to have titles, or they were tourist attractions managing heritage sites. But the Harpur-Crewe refused this evolution. They insisted on being aristocrats in the old sense: landed, titled, superior by birthright. They would not become business people. They would not commodify their heritage. That they would not acknowledge that their world had ended. So instead, they presided over its decay with dignity that looked increasingly like delusion. The psychological dimension of this decline matters as much as the economic one. The aristocracy was not just an economic system. It was an identity structure. Aristocrats understood themselves as fundamentally different from other people: better bred, more refined, destined to lead. When this identity became socially untenable, and some adapted by developing new identities, others, like the Harpur-Crewe, could not. This inability to reconceptualize their identity explains the hoarding, the isolation, the retreat. If you cannot be an aristocrat anymore, and you have no other conception of who you might be, then you cling to the physical markers of aristocracy: the house, the collections, the possessions. These become not just property, but proof of existence. To let them go would be to disappear. Calke Abbey, in its preserved state of decay, becomes a monument to this existential crisis. The house is an identity frozen in the moment it became impossible. Each locked room is an aspect of self that could not adapt. Each hoarded object is an attempt to make internal emptiness feel substantial. The building itself is a three-dimensional portrait of an identity in collapse. The eerie quality that visitors sense at Calke comes from this: the house is haunted not by ghosts, but by the ghost of an entire social class. You can feel its presence in every room: the assumption of natural superiority, the expectation of deference, the belief in aristocratic continuity, all of it persisting decades after it stopped being true. But there is also something moving in Calke's honesty. The house does not pretend. It does not offer a comforting narrative of aristocratic virtue. It simply shows what happened. This is what decline looks like. This is what it means when a social system ends. This is the human face of historical transition. The question Calke forces us to ask extends beyond aristocracy. What happens to any identity when its social foundation disappears? How do people cope when who they are becomes impossible? The Harpur-Crewe answered by retreating into delusion and decay. But their answer, while pathological, is also deeply human. We all construct identities based on external structures: career, class, community. Yeah, what happens when those structures fail? The Harpur-Crewe story suggests that without the flexibility to reconceptualize ourselves, we face the choice between adaptation and dissolution. They chose dissolution. The house documents that choice in exhaustive detail. Standing in Calke Abbey today, in rooms where the wallpaper peels and the silence presses close, you are standing inside the death of a world. Not a metaphorical death, but a real one. This social system existed for centuries. Then it ended. The Harpur-Crewe were there for the ending. They could not survive it, so they preserved it instead, creating a monument to their own extinction. The English aristocracy, as a functioning power structure, is gone. Some families maintain titles and estates, but they do so as heritage managers or diversified business owners, not as a ruling class. The system that the Harpur-Crewe refused to abandon has vanished completely. In refusing to outlive it, they achieved a strange immortality. They are remembered precisely because they embodied its death so completely. Calke Abbey is eerie because it is honest. It is moving because it is human. It is important because it refuses to let us forget what happened here. Not just to one family, but to an entire way of organizing society. The house stands as testament to the truth that nothing lasts forever. Not power, not position, not carefully constructed identities. Everything ends. The only choice is whether to adapt to that ending or be consumed by it. The Harpur-Crewe were consumed. The house they left behind is their monument and their warning. Look at what happens when preservation becomes the enemy of life. Look at what happens when the past becomes a prison. Look at what happens when a dream, no matter how beautiful, refuses to acknowledge that dreams must eventually end. The death of the English aristocracy was painful, slow, and often pathetic. Calke Abbey preserves that death with brutal honesty. And in doing so, it offers something more valuable than the usual heritage narrative of triumph and achievement. It offers the truth. Sometimes, even with every advantage, you cannot win. Sometimes, despite your best efforts, everything falls apart. Sometimes, the only legacy you leave is the evidence of your decline. This is the story Calke Abbey tells. Not a comforting story, not an inspiring story, but a true one. And in its truth lies its power and its lasting significance. The English aristocracy is dead. Long live the evidence of its dying.